Bum bum bum, literature gets a look. Legs talk about books. Hello everyone and welcome to Legs Talk About Books, the monthly literature podcast where we talk about books. I am your spooky host, Hardleg Joe. Joining me today, once again for his yearly contribution, Mr. Joseph Rothschild, aka MBT.
Hey everybody, how's it going? That's my Yugi-tuber voice, and now I'll be defaulting to my tired, grizzled old man voice for the remainder of this podcast.
I really do gotta say, if you're in the comments, give a hand to MBT. He runs like Yu-Gi-Oh! Channel, he runs a Twitch, he is very tired, exhausted. What's it, like midnight now for you?
It is 11:45 p.m., which is, yeah, I mean, it's kind of the perfect time to be talking about spooky stories. It is not the perfect time for me to retain sanity. So we'll see how this goes, but I imagine the back half of this is going to be a little one-sided. By the time we get to Styx, you're on your own, buddy. It's
quite all right. I've got quite a lot written, and we're gonna get through this.
I'm just kidding.
Way.
I really like Styx. I want to talk about Styx.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. I can't tell where the sarcasm ends and your real voice begins. The madness is already creeping in. But yes, if you missed it somehow, we have read Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos by H.P. Lovecraft and others. Mostly the others. There's like 2 Lovecraft stories in here. And we really wanted to focus on that this time. A couple of years back, we read a whole bunch of Lovecraft stories just to sort of get an idea of where his mythos was like. And this particular collection is a bunch of things kind of showcasing how that mythos spread into the ether, how it changed literature over time and kind of became the mythos that it's known of today, where like Cthulhu can show up on South Park and everyone's like, oh, I know that guy.
I do want to say real quick, a very frustrating thing that we got constantly on the other one is people just being like, you know, H.P. Lovecraft was racist. And, like, the answer to that is, yeah, of course we know. Like,
yeah.
This isn't particularly surprising. He wrote a bunch of work about how he hates, like, the Spanish, you know? Like, he was racist in ways that I had not thought possible.
He's, like, racist against, like, Italians and people from, like, southern England.
He's
like,
racist against, like, dogs. Like, we know the guy is racist, and yet, you know, the mythos is such an integral part, not only of American literature, but like of international literature, even at this point.
Yeah.
And despite, you know, the man's personal beliefs, which were really terrible, of course.
Yeah.
He does touch on this, like, very fittingly, he touches on this, like, very primordial fear and misunderstanding of the unknown. And it is such a universally human experience that it's wonderful to see how it was expanded, and for us to sit down and be able to read some individuals who have done just that.
And, you know, it really is telling that, like, the first compilation of his books was called The Outsider and Others. And if you haven't read The Outsider, I don't think we read it last year because it's personally not very spooky. It's more like an Edgar Allan Poe style, like, poem. Just about, like, this feeling of being, like, utterly alone. Of just not understanding the rest of the world. Being afraid of it. And I feel like that feeling kind of transcends everything.
Yeah, like, big surprise. Feelings of just, like, misplaced anxiety are not only meaningful for people who are anxious when they go to the grocery store and they have to see someone of a different race. They are universal to the people who are, you know, being otherized,
exactly.
You know, be it through the legal system or even through daily interactions.
Yeah.
It really is a universal human fear that is being tapped into in a lot of this work.
And you know, even then, not every single thing he wrote was about that either. You can read Color Out of Space, and just race doesn't really come into anything with it.
And the color was Italian.
That's what made it so otherworldly and alien.
Yeah. These meatballs, they are out of this universe.
Ooh. And
I know,
you know,
I'm doing Dracula here.
The other thing I like to tell people too is, like, if it makes you feel any better, Lovecraft in his time was not well known. He did not make any money. He died, like, penniless and in constant pain from stomach cancer that he could not afford to be treated. And most of his stuff is in the public domain, so by purchasing it, you are not helping him or his estate in any way. He didn't leave an estate. He died childless. So yeah, if you don't like him, you'll be happy to know nothing good happened to him.
Well, I don't feel very good about that at all. I'm going to tell you. I'll tell you right now.
So some people like to feel vindicated. I don't know. But anyway, before we really get into the individual stories, did you have any spoiler-free thoughts on like the collection as a whole? Would you recommend this to people?
You really talked up how much reading we had done at the very beginning, but I have
read...
I
guess we should mention that.
I have not read all of the book. I have read a very specific set of stories curated by Hardleg, because this whole thing is like 500 pages, and I had like a day and a half to get through it. And so the portion I read did seem to have a sort of central thematic principle, and I don't know if you were guiding me towards this or if this is actually reflected in the work proper, but there were two kind of big like macro things going on that I thought were very interesting. The first is the concept of the atomic age. So much of what Lovecraft writes about is like a ever-present permeating anxiety and an understanding that you are messing with some sort of unknown force that will ultimately culminate in not only your death, but like the potential death of humanity and like the end of the human experiment. And he died before the atomic age really got off, but that's basically how everyone felt for like decades. And a lot of this work is from like the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, and uses atomics either as a present threat or as occasionally a utility of the older gods. It's and it really is just such an apt parallel to those types of feelings.
I should ask, did you read them in the order I gave them to you, or did you kind of like skip around a little bit? Okay. Yeah, because one of the things that this particular collection did that I really liked is it kind of lays them mostly in chronological order. So you get to see at the start, like, the stories told in the 1930s while Lovecraft was still alive. And then as it goes on, sort of like the stuff that came after him, both mythos-wise, and then seeing how it evolved with the changing culture. And yeah, in which you get into the atomic
Discovery
age.
of the Gorick Zone is such a good closer for this, by the way. It's so good.
So freaking
We're going to talk
weird.
about Gorick Zone for like... Oh, we're going to talk about it for like 20 minutes. I have so much to say
I'm
about
glad
that
you liked
story in
that one,
particular.
because the first time I read it, I was like, what the fuck is this?
And then, like, I would say the second just general thing I noticed was I don't know how present the threat of shape-shifting was before I know I'm going to screw this name up, and I know it's so important that I don't. Is it Nyarlathotep?
I think so. I'm not really going to be all that much of a stickler about pronunciation when it comes to Lovecraftian stuff.
Anyway, without spoiling too much, a significant amount of these stories concern exactly that deity and its ability to change shape. And not particularly difficult to see how that was a general anxiety of people in the Western world at the start of like the Age of Spies in World War II into the Cold War.
Yeah.
And I think those two general cultural anxieties are really well expressed in this work, you know, through the lens of big, spooky, Icarus gods.
But I guess the main question, though, for a collection of horror stories is, did any of these scare you? Would you think any of them are actually, like, spooky?
Yeah.
Yeah? Which one would you say is the spookiest?
The Dweller in the Darkness is quite spooky. I found the back half of The Shadow from the Steeple very good, though not necessarily scary. Styx was frightening.
I think the one that did it for me the most, and we'll get to this more when we get there, but Notebook Found in a Deserted House.
Notebook Found is so good.
That gave me so many chills, more than like any of the other stories in here. They're all pretty good, but that one's like you could sit around a campfire and probably tell that and be like, ooh, that's got some hairs sticking up at times. So yeah, I would definitely, you know, if you're interested at all, either in this from just like spooky story perspective, or in just sort of seeing how literature changes over time, how the mythos evolved, I would definitely recommend this collection in particular. I wish I knew a better way to like tell people. I mean, I guess I got the cover up if you're watching this on YouTube, But because there's no set author, and because there's actually like 3 books called Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos, I don't know how to show this one specifically. It's got, I guess we'll list out the titles so you can look them up. Most of them are, again, public domain, even the ones that aren't Lovecraft, so you can find most of these like on YouTube. But yeah, with all that said, let's go ahead and just jump into the stories. And again, I've read all of them. MBT just read sort of like a curated list. So I've got just like a brief explanation for the ones you didn't read. We'll just go down one after another. Of course, this starts with The Call of Cthulhu, which you did read last year, right?
Yeah.
And that was, I forget if we agreed last time, but it's like, I don't feel like Call of Cthulhu is like his strongest work.
There is a foundation for a lot of the stuff that comes afterwards, but
yeah,
I found it kind of mids.
Yeah, I feel almost like you could skip it. That sounds bad because it's
you should probably read it, but
it's called the Cthulhu Mythos. It's named after Cthulhu, but he doesn't play a huge role in a lot of the stuff that happens. Most of the extended universe kind of deals with all the other deities, the things mentioned in like Shadow over Innsmouth and Nark.
And like these, this is explained in this work as well. It's like Cthulhu is a priest. He's not like an ultimate powerful being.
Yeah.
Of course, that's, changed and edited as people find that he is extremely popular, but
By the way, if you're curious about the mythology, because I did do some research and stuff on this, the all-powerful being in the Lovecraft mythos is Azathoth. And apparently in letters...
The blind idiot god.
Yeah. Apparently in letters and stuff, Lovecraft was like, I really hope they call this the Azathoth mythos, because that makes a lot more sense than the Cthulhu mythos.
God, I'm sorry, man. Oh, the Yu-Gi-Oh players are carrying the torch for you. We've banned half the cards inspired by your shit, by the way. Our
Somehow.
bad.
I remember when all those came out, it's like, oh, these are useless. And then within like 5 years, the hidden creeping terror of all of them.
What have we banned? It's Azathoth and Norden.
And Norden, yeah, which didn't show up in this.
Sheesh. Entis coming up soon.
Yeah. But yeah, so Call of Cthulhu, kind of foundational, but not really his best work. I guess read it if you want to know who Cthulhu is. And then after that, we've got Return of the Sorcerer by Clark Ashton Smith, which I had you...
So you were very smart here. You have front-loaded the ones I have not read.
Yeah.
So go for it, buddy.
But yeah, I front-loaded them for a reason. The first one, The Return of the Sorcerer, is literally like a spooky ghost story about like an undead sorcerer that brings back a corpse. It's like 1930s like pulp horror. And the only reason it's included in this is because instead of reaching for the usual like satanistic, paganistic stuff that they do, the sorcerer is like, oh, I have here the Necronomicon and the Book of Ebon and the Mystery of the Worm and all these books that Lovecraft came out, just to sort of show that, like, on a very aesthetic level, his mythology was kind of creeping into even basic stories about, like, witches and spooky demons and stuff like that. Again, you can probably skip it. Other than that, there's not a whole lot to it. The next two, Ubo Sathla, also by Clark Ashton Smith, and The Black Stone by Robert E. Howard, are both examples of, like, writers trying their hand out at Lovecraft-style stories while he was still alive, and not really succeeding all that well. Like, they're
there's going to be a couple of these, by the way.
Yeah, they continue to not succeed, but these are exceptionally good at not succeeding well, if that makes sense. Like, they're undoubtedly attempts at cosmic horror, but you could tell they were, like, new to it because a whole lot of old horror cliches slip in. Like, Ubo Sathla is kind of neat because it deals with, like, non-linear time and a prehistoric entity. But that prehistoric entity is just, like, a sorcerer from Atlantis who is using a secret Satan stone to look into the future.
It actually kind of rocks that Atlantis features so heavily in these. You could make a pretty compelling case that, like, Disney is occultic and that Atlantis, the film, was meant to paper over, like, a satanic past of this lost, city of Lemuria or whatever.
The point is, you can kind of skip those. They're decent, spooky stories, but that one deals more with sorcerers. The other one deals with, like, cults. The cult worships, like, a frog deity, that kind of looks like a Lovecraftian thing. But the spooky thing about it is that they're doing human sacrifices, which is just like kind of lame in the Lovecraft mythos. Like, you gotta be more cosmic about that. Why aren't they like devouring time or eating our souls or something? But yeah, where we get really interesting and where you jump in is The Hounds of Tindalos by Frank Belknap Long.
So, this is one that I had heard of prior. It is very famous, of course, and did not resonate with me. I read it and I went, that's all right. Really did feel like they were just trying to grasp at the sort of instinctual fears of the like non-Euclidean geometry and like the Call of Cthulhu. It was not until I read the doles in here that it clicked for me that this is the inspiration for the fucking Tindangle archetype in Yu-Gi-Oh!
Yes!
I don't know how I didn't know this. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, for those of you who are watching just for literature, all 4 or 5 of you, there's an archetype of monsters that are all like trapahedroids and stuff called Tindangles.
Yeah. And it's just where you look at like acute Cerberus is their boss monster, and it's like
oh,
you
yes,
literally just named an angle and a type of mythological dog. Thank you, Yu-Gi-Oh! And mistakenly, I found that a lot of players say that, like, oh, this is based off a Lovecraft story. Like, no, it's based off a Lovecraftian story, but not actually written by him. Different author. But it has all, like, the hallmarks, right? Sort of this looking at horror from a more scientific angle. I'm not sure if you've read a lot of horror from, like, back in the 30s, but a lot of it's really, really rooted in, like, you know, seances and ghosts and like pagan witchcraft. So the fact that someone like uses a psychotropic drug and a mathematical formula to stare back in time and find extra dimensional beings is just like way ahead of its time and way off kilter from everything else that was going on at the time.
Right. Like you said, it does have a lot of the same hallmarks of Lovecraft. It does feel like a bit of an imitation. And I also thought it was kind of like poorly written. This is such a pedestrian critique, but there's just like sentences that use the same like phraseology just one after the other. And it's like, geez, dude, you got like a proofreader or something.
Yeah.
Many of these early stories were published not entirely in one volume. They were submitted over the course of several weeks to like a newspaper, which would print, you know, X hundred words, and then you would
magazine.
You would get paid based on how many installments there were. So this one and the next one as well suffer from a problem where there is an invented second act in order to squeeze maybe another week or 2 out of it. Yeah. And you know, I understand that, but I do think the story suffers as a result. I think the interesting thing to come out of this one is the concept of the Cthulhu adjacent like mythos guys, in this case the Hounds of Tindalos, not as like an ancient evil, right? There is definitely a primordial sense to the Hounds, but it's like really hammered home in here that these entities aren't acting in a human capacity or understanding of good and evil. There is not a conscious thought in their mind towards like the actions of humanity. They are acting instinctually.
Yeah.
These hounds, for instance, you know, might not be particularly intelligent or sentient beings. They might just be like predators that like smell prey. Their prey simply operates on a different dimensional bound of understanding. The concept that there are dummies with like 4th dimensional capacities is a very interesting one, because you get exposed to this entire ecosystem of monsters within the larger mythos, not just like 5 or 6 extremely large gods that can kill you in one hit, but also like random like rattlesnake adjacent guys. You know, what is the function of a Shoggoth? You know, and I think the Hounds of Tindalos are primarily interesting in the same way that like any force of nature would be.
Yeah, it kind of hits under the same thing, you know, we talked about with Azathoth, which you remember, the blind idiot god. Azathoth is not malicious, it's just this big, huge thing that, like, is sleeping, and by tossing in its sleep, just casually causes mass destruction and hysteria and chaos. It's
and
sort
there
of
is
this,
like this weird humanization of some of the gods as like evil beings by both Lovecraft and, you know, his subsidiaries.
Oh yeah.
But
Narcolepthep is like
he's a real
absolutely
jerk
evil.
ass.
Yeah.
But it is nice to know that like many of these exist as, you know, forces of nature.
Yeah. And this is one of the things where, again, like, Hounds of Tindalos, not the scariest story, not the most well-written story. I feel like it's more important for sort of, like, what it represents, because not only does it show, like, someone else taking the Lovecraft mythos for the first time and really making something that's, if nothing else, memorable, but it also has some elements that would definitely permeate literature, like, even to this day. Like, some of the stuff, how it's written almost scientifically, especially at the end where they're like, you know, a newspaper report is telling about this, a scientist is writing this in a document. You could sort of see the foundations for what would eventually be like the SCP Foundation. Stuff like found footage movies. Sort of taking
I mean,
a
I'm
little
not going to
trip
say
from
anything,
that.
but like certainly the Lovecraft adjacent writers were like the first like SCP board posters of their time, right?
Exactly. I was going to say earlier, like, we talked about most of these were published in like magazines, and if you look back to like the 1930s, magazines were the internet of the time. There were so many, like hundreds of them, and that was your only way to communicate with people who were in different parts of the country. You would write letters to them that would be posted in the back, and people would have these long back and forths. They'd find out your address and send you a mean comment through the snail mail that you get 2 months later.
There's a reference, I believe, in Space Eaters to a many unpleasant pieces of mail and a particularly perturbing phone call. And I'm like, damn, like my address has been online by this point.
Yeah, and that's the thing. A lot of these people, like, at least writing early on, like, they knew Lovecraft. They never met him, but they had written letters to him, and he was just like, yeah, sure, whatever you want to talk about. And they were pen pals for like years and years. You just kind of did this back then, before the internet. But yeah, regardless, let's go ahead. The next one, which you also read, and by the same author, The Space Eaters.
And unfortunately has a lot of the same problems. This one is really poorly written. I'm sorry, Frank, you know, my bad. I don't think I could probably do better. You know, I sit down and look at a Google Doc and then write 4 terrible puns about, you know, 10-year-old card game. But this one is not good. I
actually have written down here, like, despite the clunky opening, he does a decent job at explaining what cosmic horror is all about. That monologue at the beginning,
where
he's like, how do I describe a new type of horror? It's super clunky, it's not well written, but it's like the best, most clearest example I could think of like, this is what they were searching for at the time, even if they couldn't do it very well.
The author character is like clearly like a self-insert. And is having trouble, you know, putting pen to paper and describing a horror that doesn't exist, which is how I imagine every contemporary of Lovecraft felt.
So, funny story, the author character in this is not a self-insert, it's supposed to be Lovecraft.
Awesome. That's amazing.
It's fanfic. The author's self-insert is the other character who's like, why are you being so stressful about this? It's not that big a deal. And then he introduces like a local bumpkin character who had a run-in with a Lovecraftian beast and describes it perfectly in like very simple language. And the author gets really mad.
The author is also out here being like, I have lived in a state of general anxiety, you know, I understand the horrors that claw at the reaches of mankind. Then this guy comes in and he's like, yeah, so an alien poked my head open, and he goes, fool, you mad fool, such a thing is impossible. And it's like, please, like, why the fuck would you possibly say that?
An alien touched my brain, and now it feels like cold burning fire, but in my soul.
It also has the most transparent use of what I was speaking of earlier, where you would try and milk another issue out of the publisher, where the doctor comes in. There's just like a doctor in the third act who shows up, like, is as scared as everyone else, and then leaves. And it's like, dude, that's crazy. Like, wow, excellent. Did this come out before or after Color Out of Space? Do you know?
I do not know. I could probably look it up real quick if you don't mind.
It's gotta be after, because a lot of this is like, really feels like I mean, obviously a loving tribute because this person was part of like the Lovecraft in-group, but very much cribbing and imitating some of the stuff in Color Out of Space.
Yeah, this was exactly 1 year after Color Out of
Big
Space.
Surprise. Yeah. No, the one very weird thing in this one that is found nowhere in any of these other works is what I can only describe as Christian propaganda.
Yeah.
So a bit of a spoiler here if you haven't read the work. But a significant amount of this work is concerned with one's ability to comprehend shape, and seeing a particular mark or shape or ghostly apparition of a hand dooms you to was kind of like a mind flaying, right?
Yeah.
There is a protection, which is if you make the sign of the cross over yourself and really mean it. You can't not mean it.
Yeah.
One guy doesn't mean it and he gets killed. You have to really mean it. Then you're saved. And at the very end of the work, this is a huge spoiler. At the very end of the work, this evil primordial demon functionally possesses the Lovecraft write-in, I suppose. And Jesus saves the life of the author's self-insert by intervening and filling the room with a cleansing hot fire in the shape of a cross. It's out of this world. I read it and I was like, wow, just amazing, just fantastic.
Listen, I had to include this one, particularly you're like, in no other stories. This is kind of the thing I was talking about with the earlier ones. A lot of 1930s horror, because it's so obsessed with like paganism and Satanism and witchcraft, which is tied to Satan. A lot of the cures are like preachers like holding up a cross or like spreading holy water and stuff. Like Christianity was the solution to most horror stories in that time.
Right.
And this is like an example of someone trying to do this interdimensional mind-flaying beast that is also stopped by the holy power of the cross.
It is so interesting that so many of these other stories are about a Christian sect that has like one bad week and like breaks off just a little too far, or like a preacher who believes like the Christ to be an old god, and largely the remainder of these stories are shockingly secular. Like none of the people are like, yeah, we got to go pray to Jesus and that's going to get us out of this, except for this one in which like Christ descends and like epically owns this old god.
That was, as the time went on, the Christian solving the Cthulhu mythos kind of faded out. As it did in most... I mean, it's the same thing even with, like, vampires, right? You look at old vampire stories, and it's like...
They see the cross, and they're like, damn, I lose.
They're like, fuck, I guess I gotta leave. And now you get to, like, Blade, and it's like, what's the fuck's that supposed to do? So then we get to The Dweller in the Darkness by August Derleth, which is another one you read. I just want to say, first off, this is, like, the first one in the set that actually kind of scared me a bit.
Yeah,
especially near the start.
I wrote here, this is the first really good one. Like, this, I would recommend, if you go away from these and you're like, I don't need the preface of the ones that are, like, hokey and silly and have, like, Draculas and shit, start with Dweller in the Darkness. It's just incredible. It is...
I would say Derleth is really great about writing about places in the same way that Lovecraft is.
Yeah.
Like, I remember last year you were talking about how in the Dunwich Horror, Lovecraft manages to capture this distinctly New England mood of dread.
Yeah.
He writes about the rural hills of northeastern America and how there's this sense of, like, decaying aristocracy mixed with rural superstition that creates this mutated inbred branch of, like, distinctly American horror.
Mm-hmm.
And Derleth does that for the Midwest. He captures these, like,
this
dark,
almost exactly.
ancient woods.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you 100%. Does a fantastic job here.
Yeah, just, like, the sense of, like, the untamed lakes and rivers, the absolute vastness of everything.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who lives in the Midwest, I forget where you're at exactly.
Oh, me? No longer in the Midwest. But, you know, I was...
Good.
I was raised in Kansas, to which there is a lot of debate as to whether it counts as the Midwest and isn't like its own separate thing called the Great Plains. But the thing that it shares with some of the like more deciduous states is just this sense of scale. Like, you just don't get it in in city living, an understanding that like everyone is all kind of crammed up together. But if you go like traveling in West Kansas, just like if you go exploring in like any of the Great Lakes regions, you get a sense that like you are dwarfed by something. Like there is a great nothingness out there. And you know, the human mind sees gaps and tries to fill them. And often, you know, you would feel like, oh my God, I'm being watched, or there is a huge, indescribable presence among like the trees or the plains. And I mean, that's just front and center in this. It is just wonderful, wonderful writing.
Like I said, I live in Missouri, and Missouri has like St. Louis. That's like the only major city, right? And you're in St. Louis, and you're kind of in civilization, but you go like an hour west, and you're out in the Boot Hills. And I've been like out to the Ozarks. I've been in these big mountains where it's just this. You go up a little bit and you look down, and just this green vastness as far as you could see. And maybe it's just because I've never been much of a nature guy, but some people see that and they're like, oh, the beauty. And I'm like, there's just so much untamed stuff that can kill me out there.
I've massively become a nature guy in the last like 2 or 3 years. After living in New York for a while, I was like, I can't fucking do this. This is a whole different kind of evil. This is the New England evil. And where I am now, there's a lot of nature trails. And I remember there was one that I deliberately got lost in, like maybe because you can't get lost anymore because of phones and GPS and shit. But I got as lost as I could. And I just like stood, and you could not hear civilization. But like Derleth writes in here, you could hear this great like wind, like a horrible and it felt wonderful in the majesty of the thing, but there was also an understanding that like this is a system that will tear you to shreds if you ever give it an opportunity to do so.
It's good in the sunlight.
Yeah.
If it gets dark, it suddenly becomes a lot worse.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's especially in Missouri, growing up learning about like state history and stuff. We have this big sense of like the pioneering spirit, Lewis and Clark leading off to expand the wilderness. Mm-hmm. And Derleth kind of captures the dark side of the pioneering spirit. Right. This sense of like, I'm going out into nothingness, and then you just never return. Mm-hmm. And there's just like death.
It is very funny.
An uncaring cosmic death.
It is very
ironically
fitting, I guess is the better word. It is very fitting that this is a story. I guess I'll just give you all a quick overview real quick so we can operate from the same understanding.
We're in the spoiler zone anyway,
So in Dweller in the Darkness, a professor goes off on basically a wild goose hunt to find out about a local legend and does not return. His two friends follow suit to try and find him, and in doing so, they stumble upon the fucking Nyarlathotep. That's that. But they are doing so in a remote cabin along Rick's Lake is the name of the large lake. And it is so fitting that it happens in like an escape cabin, like what is clearly like a vacation home meant to be inhabited like in a liminal sense, like as a transient place, right? Like you go in, you're there for a week, you go out, maybe you don't notice anything is wrong because you're there for such a short period of time. And the counterbalance to this is Nyarlathotep is using the earth in the same way as a safe haven to drop into, like maybe for a week at a time, and then whoop, like fuck off back to space. For some reason, these two vastly different consciousnesses are using the same plot of earth as a vacation home. It's very fun. It's also like this one is rooted in a type of mythology that just isn't really visible in any of the others, and that's like indigenous mythology. Early on, they describe Nyarlathotep as a Wendigo, which is like this like First Nations like
cryptid,
I guess I would say.
It's hard to really say what it is because there's so many different versions of it.
Nyarlathotep is like almost described also as like a skinwalker in this, like like a shape-shifting sort of demon, and it's very interesting to see the mythos just divorced in that way from decidedly like New England European understandings of like cryptids and of horror and of like Draculas and shit, and it sticks. like Nyarlathotep as a shape-shifting individual shows up like 4 or 5 more times. Like, clearly this was a compelling understanding of what it was within the power of like the old gods to do. I guess this is the outer gods. But yeah.
This is I haven't read the story that Nyarlathotep comes from, but from what I understand in the original Lovecraftian story, it's very kind of vague. It's shown that he can shapeshift. It's shown that unlike a lot of the other Lovecraftian gods, it not only takes an interest in humanity, but it actively wills harm against humanity. Like, it's not just like malevolent because it's so far advanced, like it actually doesn't like us, which is very scary for a Lovecraftian thing. And August Derleth is kind of known as the guy who took Lovecraft's base ideas and really expanded them like into a mythology. Mm-hmm. He's the one who created the hierarchy of like the outer gods versus the elder gods. Mm-hmm. And he talks kind of about how he really wanted to give like an elemental flair, where he saw Cthulhu and he's like, clearly Cthulhu is like the water elemental. Mm-hmm. And clearly like there's like a fire demon or a fire beast
Cthugha.
Described as like a Cthugha, which is a burning like eye of flame. And he's like, oh, that's the fire elemental. And now suddenly you have an almost like a Greek pantheon of these different Lovecraft beings that are all interacting, and in this case actively fighting each other.
That is such a good term for it, like a pantheon.
Yeah.
It is not until Nyarlathotep that you get an understanding that there are limitations to these things. Like, it does not make, like, previous run-ins with, like, deep ones or old ones or shit like that have been just, like, you look at them and you go, oh, no, my eyes are burning out of my head, right? Nyarlathotep shows up, turns into a person, has a conversation with these two in English, in full view of them, and then leaves. And it's like, it's like this guy could have just annihilated them, but he didn't for some reason. And you get a sense that like he couldn't. Something about like the time that he did it, or the mechanism by which he made it into the house. It's a lot like the like vampiric kind of, you can't do this unless I say so, permission murder.
And that's the really, like, the flip side of Derleth, right? Is, like, a lot of people really like him for canonizing all these rules, for making it seem like there's some order to it, and other people hate him specifically because this wasn't supposed to have rules. These things were not supposed to be, like, you know, an extended universe where you could pick your favorite character. They were supposed to be unimaginable horrors.
When are the Avengers gonna fight Nyarlathotep? That's what I want to know.
And so...
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Do yours. Because I got one more bit of trivia, but it's not really related to the story. So sure. If you've got anything about the story, go ahead.
Yeah. Last thing I want to say before we move on to this one, and I'm sorry we've spent like 20 minutes on this singular one. It's also got this like very subtle critique of academia, which is extremely fucking funny. Obviously, the big guy's a professor, and you know the actual best source of knowledge in the work is this dumb idiot hillbilly drunk. And one of the professors mentioned in this work is expelled from academia on extremely flimsy understandings of like him being a communist sympathizer. It's like this really subtle jab that like, yeah, everyone knew that like we were using "you're a communist" as a way to purge the academy. Just thrown in here to purge the academy of someone who knew the true identity of the outer gods.
Someone who's just like not worth the trouble. Like, he's saying some weird shit. We can't disprove it, but we can kind of prove that he might be a communist. Exactly, and that's all you need in those days.
I mean, you didn't even need proof. You just say it. Done.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, there is actually one other thing about this story that makes it notable, which is when they're talking to the old guy. He's like, yes, I've read from all the ancient books. The Necronomicon, the Book of Ebon, the Mystery der Wormis, and of course, The Outsider and Others by H.P. Lovecraft.
Many times, a Lovecraft work is cited alongside the Necronomicon, and all the ones that are written while he's alive, I'm like, come on, dude. I get that you want to suck up to him, but like...
So, that's the thing, right? Is this was written after he died.
Oh, hell yeah. Respect for Derleth grows.
Lovecraft was never published as a book in his lifetime. The first compilation of his stories outside of magazines was The Outsider and Others. And it was published by August Derleth.
Hilarious. That's so... Wait, it's an ad. Never mind.
That's how I'm like, is this a touching tribute to his lost friend? Or is he advertising the company he just started to print Lovecraft's works? Hard to say, hard to leg. I'll leave that up to you to decide. So after that, we had Beyond the Threshold, which was also by Derleth. And honestly, I'm kind of not sure why they included this one. I didn't have you read this one. Mostly because in a lot of ways, it's just like a worse version of Dweller in the Darkness. It has all the same elements, like Midwestern setting, woods. They even do that same thing where they're like, I can hear the wind, but none of the trees are moving. Which was kind of creepy the first time, and
that's the exact same setup.
Yeah, they the exact same thing. They're like in a cabin out in the woods. The only difference is there's a guy in the cabin actively trying to summon Ithaqua, the Wind Walker.
Oh yeah, my bad. That was me.
That was
funny.
But yeah, the only thing I could think of is why this might be interesting is because Ithaqua is now considered like an old god up there with, Narcolept and Cthulhu and all those other ones. But this was the first one created specifically by Derleth, where he was like, there's a water and there's a fire, so there should be a wind and an earth. So Ithaqua is the wind monster. Adding deities to the mythos. And then we get to the interesting trilogy. Shambler from the Stars by Robert Bloch.
Okay, so I actually hated this one. I thought it sucked.
Oh, it's awful.
Thank God.
Okay, so first of all, do you know who Robert Bloch is?
Yeah, I do. Is this the first of his that we're doing?
Yeah.
Oh, sick. Okay, so we do read like 4 Robert Blochs. He's all in this anthology just over and over again. He wrote Psycho.
Yeah. He went on to be a very, very prodigious author. The Shambler in the Stars was written when he was 17.
That makes sense because it's not very good.
It's not very good, and it's also about him meeting his pen pal, an author who's reclusive and writes horror and lives in Providence, Rhode Island. Yep. And then he gets killed by a spooky vampire.
I will say Shambler from the Stars is... I mean, it's funny for a number of reasons, but the biggest reason is it is very, very clear that Bloch is not cut out for this specific kind of writing. And we'll get to it in Shadow from the Steeple and Notebook Found in a Deserted House, but the very transparent attempt to just one-for-one reproduce a Lovecraft work in Shambler from the Stars is like, sheesh, come on.
Yeah. Like I said, it really does, like, you could tell it's just a 17-year-old kid who really liked Lovecraft, and then not only copied him, but wrote a story in which Lovecraft gets killed.
It's very fun because in it he finds a book called Mysteries of the Worm, and then at the end he goes, maybe someday I will truly find the mysteries of the worm. Roll credits. Quick synopsis for those at home. The Shambler in the Stars is about H.P. Lovecraft villain accidentally summoning like a big blob that sucks out all his blood in one hit, and then
it cracks him in half.
Like, it snaps him in half, and the kid goes, someday that'll be me getting killed by the big spooky man.
Lovecraft he never says it's Lovecraft, but he basically like describes everything about Lovecraft and like how he looks and everything.
Yeah.
And then it's just like, yeah, he gets cracked in half, he gets drained of his blood, and I ran out, and then I set his house on fire to burn down the evidence. That was also great.
Is like he sets the house on fire and then he like leaves, and he's like, I felt very good looking at the house fire and knowing that no one would connect it to me, and I was like, really? I don't know, man. You're kind of writing about it now. There was one good image from this, and that's the little blob fucker is a little bit invisible. It's one of those like, you can only really see it if you look at it, and maybe you catch a couple of veins until it sucks all the blood out of Lovecraft, at which point it becomes like visible because you can see the blood through its translucent body.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's pretty cool. That's kind of sick.
That creature has been used in other Lovecraft mythos stories since then. They call it a star vampire.
Okay, that's really stupid, actually.
So the funny thing from this, right, is like, Robert Bloch writes a story about meeting Lovecraft, and Lovecraft gets killed in a very bloody way. And then, a year later, Lovecraft writes a story called The Haunter in the Dark about a young writer named Robert Blake, very different, don't confuse the two, he's not Robert Bloch, who comes to meet Lovecraft and then ends up, like, discovering this ancient cult that worships a weird thing that summons a haunter in the dark that torments his nightmares and drives him insane. You could see him being like, okay, kid, I see what you did. Now let me show you how it's done.
Yeah, I do want to, if we can move to Haunter in the Dark now, I feel so bad for Robbie. I mean, he got flexed on. It is good that this compendium includes, like, some Lovecraft, because, wow, after reading, like, the fucking early ones, the Oasis that was the one Derleth you had me read, and then you get a Lovecraft, it was like, oh my god, he really knew what he was doing. Yeah. The Haunter of the Dark is incredible. One of my favorites that we read. There's just so much to talk about. You go first, and I'll gush in a little bit.
I actually didn't have a whole lot from it, other just like I thought it was really cool. I liked the connection just with the fact that he brings Blake in as a character to kill him, and just a couple like neat little trivia facts. This was actually the last story he published before he died.
Jesus.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
It's a good one. I can't imagine what it would be like to be Bloch, to like write this thing about your favorite author, right? And then the last thing he writes is a story where he kills you in it.
Right. You killed him. It's fair. So there's so much I want to talk about Haunter in the Dark. Quick synopsis.
Go for it.
This is one of those, like, there's a church that's gone awry. What was the one we read about that previously? It was like a worm church.
That was Jerusalem's Lot.
Oh, god damn it. Oh, okay, that's a spoiler. No, clearly this is the story that inspired Jerusalem's Lot. It is a church gone awry. They call themselves the Church of the Starry Wisdom sect, and they basically have come into possession of an ancient Egyptian artifact, which is a trapezoidahedron.
Yeah. Which, fun fact, did you know that is a Yu-Gi-Oh card?
It is also a Yu-Gi-Oh card. Yep, it's called Forbidden Trapezoidahedron. And it looks exactly like the Yu-Gi-Oh card. It's a big, sick-ass diamond that glows from within, suspended in a ring bearer's case.
Oddly shaped box.
Yeah, by like 7 iron bands. And also, if you read fucking SCP shit, this is, in my opinion, the story that is responsible for a lot of the imagery in the first ever Apollyon tiered anomalous object, which is it's like a staircase that leads to where they're like fucking guiding, they're like have Satan chained up or some stupid shit. But very fantastic work. It has a bunch of stuff that I love. The Haunter of the Dark is some kind of old unnatural entity we know very little about, that has been kept at bay by the advent of modern lighting. There is like an understanding that it fears the light in some capacity, and as streetlights have become more plentiful, as the world has industrialized, there's no longer a place for individuals and entities like this.
Yeah, it's like trapped in this old decaying church that no one wants to touch.
So this church was doing blood sacrifices, the city shut it down, and basically this entity has been trapped in a tower since then. And one stupid asshole who writes about shamblers takes a walk up the church steeple, closes the box and then opens it again, which is implied to be a thing that summons the entity. And the entity establishes some sort of psychic link with him and then uses him.
Stares into the trapezoidroid.
Yeah.
And now it can see him.
Yeah, and like hunts him in some capacity as well. It is really, really good and preys upon a very natural fear of the dark. And it ends up fucking him up because there's a power outage.
Yeah. And that's that thing, right? Is like, it's not just that there's this horrible entity, it's the buildup. Mm-hmm. Because he knows, he's got this link with it, so he keeps having these dreams where he's like, I know it knows where I am, I know it's watching me, it's just waiting for its time. And then the thunderstorm comes, and he's looking out over this hill, and he could just see neighborhood after neighborhood, the lights going out, and knowing that as soon as the lights go out here, like, it's coming for me. It wants me. And it's woo.
Other good stuff in here. There is some very tasteful racism. Those silly old superstitious Italians.
Yeah, I wasn't lying earlier.
No, yeah, this really is the Italian one. It's amazing. The funniest, like almost comedic in this one, is the concept of property rights. Like a lot of Lovecraft stories are about how the industrialized world threatens the old systems of power that are actually like kind of on a hairpin trigger. And it turns out the things that we are doing can disturb them in ways that are very bad for us. But in this one, the thing that is disturbing is largely a complete construct, which is the current system of property law in the Western world. The reason the church is allowed to stand for as long as it is because the people own it in fee simple. So like the city can't do anything about it until like an heir no longer exists. And as a result, they are able to basically do a shitload of sacrifices until it violates public policy and the city gets to step in. It's hilarious.
It's actually funny. I was looking up some stuff about Lovecraft, like, right before we went on, especially about his death, to find out, like, which stories were before and after he died. And I found this little thing where it's like, oh, Lovecraft was a big fan of the aristocracy. He wasn't all that big on democracy and such until the Great Depression happened.
Yeah.
He was apparently, before the Great Depression, he was like, if the Great Depression happens, then the noble aristocracy will step up and they'll help take care of America. And when they didn't, he went like hard left into socialism.
That's hilarious. A very strange end of his life.
He's on record as being like, FDR's New Deal doesn't go far enough.
It's crazy.
And you can kind of see it seeping into this a little bit, where he's like, those damn landlords.
I will also say, as a final note, this also has a sign as a protection spell, which is kind of funny. And it is almost 1-for-1, where if you've ever played World of Horror, the end sequences where you walk up a church steeple are almost like completely cribbed from this.
I have not played World of
We
Horror.
played it on stream.
Did we?
Yeah, for
like
way back when.
That was like 3 a.m. and you were half drunk and I wasn't paying attention. Either way, the interesting thing about this is that it's followed up. This is one of the few times that the book doesn't go in chronological order, because in 1950, 14 years after the original one, Robert Bloch steps back in to write a sequel.
So
he writes a sequel to The Haunter of the Dark, where a character is investigating his fictional death.
This is a strange one, for sure. The self-inserts go to unbelievable proportions here.
He's still not that great of a writer at this point. It's still a little bit before Psycho, but it's much better than The Shambler from the Stars.
I will say the beginning is extremely clunky, and basically the first 10 pages are just 2 pages that he writes 4 times. And it's like, dude, and also there's a synopsis of the last one in it. It's amazing.
Which, to be fair, if you were someone in 1950 reading weird tales, what are the chances that you remember the shadow from the steeple from like 1930 something?
Fair. For what it's worth, Robert Bloch did not write fucking like cosmic unknowable horror for very long. And he ended up writing functionally a lot of thrillers. And the back half of this one is literally just a thriller. It's like a crime story. It's like a fucking whodunit for the last 5 pages. Yeah. And when it's that, it's kind of like sort of compelling. I really did enjoy it.
You could see why he was good at writing like mysteries and noir and thrillers, just anything in that kind of vein.
It's basically Lovecraft as a backdrop for what ends up being a noir. The really painstaking part is just the setup for the noir. The scale in this one is exceptionally small. The whole thing takes place in one room, like in a hallway into a room. And it's more Nyarlathotep, first of all, being a shapeshifter. But it is the first one of these in the anthology that expresses some sort of fear about atomics. Yeah. The concept of atomic warfare. It is very critical of Albert Einstein. It implies that the Manhattan Project was an op facilitated by the old gods to create human misery.
Yeah.
And like but it does kind of fit.
Yeah.
The sickly glow from like the fucking shape-shifting of Nyarlathotep and like the bioluminescence that's like referenced in like some later works here is attributed to radiation poisoning.
It's one of those things where, like, you know, a lot of Lovecraft stuff, Color Out of Space in particular, kind of deals with like this proto-radiation, this glowing, this sickening green that kind of turns stuff to dust while mutating it. And he wrote that like before the Atomic Age. He wrote a lot of like these poems, which he quotes a Lovecraft poem in here about like the world shall turn to ash and stuff. And it's really interesting how he recontextualizes that in the 1950s, where suddenly the glowing is radiation, the ash is nuclear fallout.
This is it's also great that like in, let's say, the Space Eaters, there's that system where the guy's like, how dare you say this, these are the ravings of a mad lunatic, and like throughout all of Lovecraft's, everyone says that fucking shit. But in this one, the shape-shifted Nyarlathotep, instead of saying that, he goes, these are the background anxieties of the concept of atomic warfare. You're just like the rest of the Americans who were afraid that like the creation of larger and larger scale nuclear weapons is a net negative. And I assure you that they're safe and they'll be deployed as effectively. Like no longer being like, you're crazy, being like, no, these are justified fears. I do possess that scale of power. I'm just not going to use it in a bad way.
Don't worry. You can trust me. I'm not secretly the hunter in the dark.
Right. And it is a very, honestly, pretty ingenious take on the background anxiety of Lovecraftian mythos translated to the background anxiety of the Atomic Age. And
yeah, I
mean, I don't know. I would encourage you, if you're listening, to read some literature from around that era, because it is all like this. Like from the year 1943 to like 1980. Like every week, the United States or Russia would invent like a bomb that could kill like 10 million more people. And like everyone at all times was like, I guess we're going to fucking die in a nuclear holocaust.
Yeah, when you're talking about like, you know, science will doom us and their powers beyond our understanding. Yeah, it does kind of feel like nuclear energy is a little like that. But yeah, those three, not the best stories ever, but I really love just sort of like that together they make an awesome trilogy.
Yeah.
Of like the initial story of Lovecraft being killed by Blake, the response, and then Blake's sequel 14 years later. It's like, it's nice to see the evolution of everything. Even if you don't like the literature stuff, sort of seeing the historical story behind everything. It's just, that's really neat. You don't see kind of stuff like that very often. And that was followed up by my favorite in this collection, Notebook Found in a Deserted House.
This one was so good. It's you don't believe it's by Robert Bloch. It's that good.
No. It's so, and it does something that like Lovecraft stories have not done ever, and it seems so obvious now, and that it's written from the perspective of a child.
Yeah.
It's like, it starts out like, my name is whatever, I'm 12 years old, and I'm writing this because people are coming to get me, and I never did anyone nothing wrong. And something about having that perspective that just makes him like more vulnerable, but also like more open to these ideas, just makes everything infinitely more frightening.
This one contains the N-word, so people at home are really excited. It's a trick. It's the kid is sounding out a Shoggoth chant and just like and says the N-word.
Yeah.
It
appears randomly because he's just trying to phonetically get it out. He's like, it sounded
just scanning
something
the
like...
page, and I'm like,
like, what now?
It sounded something like.
But you know, ironically, the thing about this that kind of stuck out to me too is that whereas in many Lovecraft stories, there's this sort of idea of like the cultist being of lower breed, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's racist, sometimes it's just like, oh, them people out in the hills, but it's always like the uneducated, the inbred, the ugly ones are the cultists. And I love that this does the opposite of that, where you have this guy showing up in a suit, and he's like, oh, I'm your what was it? Your cousin coming to visit from out of town. And they're like, where's your suitcase? He's like, no, I just left it at the train station. I'm hoping you could come pick me up. It'll be fine. And he seems so nice and friendly. And then, like, things instantly turn sinister with him.
Yeah.
And I love that, like, flipping of everything. That's part of also what makes it so frightening, is that, like, literally anyone can be a cultist. It's not just the ugly-looking witch doctor. It's the astute-looking professor in a suit is also on the side of evil.
So the short synopsis of this one is, like you said, it's from the perspective of a little kid writing what is effectively his last will and testament as people break down the door to drag him off to the fucking nether realm or whatever. Over the course of a couple of months before Halloween, strange things start sort of happening around where he lives, which is some sort of forest that has a dark and spooky past. It becomes clear that things are kind of coming to a head. His uncle goes to pick up his cousin, and they just disappear. They do not come back. Then one night, the mom disappears as well.
Yeah, he lives with his aunt and uncle, who are out in the middle of the woods. And then, the uncle doesn't show back up, and the aunt just, like, disappears out of her bed one night, and he's just left alone in this house. Where it's the nearest neighbor is, 5 hours walk away?
He decides that he is going to set out for town on Halloween evening so that he doesn't have to be there for Halloween, which he expects is going to fucking suck. He is correct. An individual who appears to be his cousin arrives and is clearly not his cousin. And then the local...
the mailman.
Yeah, the local mailman escorts the kid out.
Who only comes by once a week.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the super creepy, like, the mailman who comes by once a week, this one, like, trusted adult, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, he'll be able to take me in his truck. He could take me to the next town. And the cousin's like, no, you'll be fine with me. Just stay inside. I'll talk to the mailman. And then he sees the mailman driving off, and he's like, no, he runs out there. And I love the fact, for a second, or you're not sure if the mailman's going to be like, help the kid. And then he pulls the gun on the cousin, and he's like, I don't know you, stranger, but I know this kid, and this kid would never lie, so you get the fuck back.
It was like, and then on the way back they run into a Shoggoth, and
it starts raining.
Yeah, and he happens upon an ancient druidic ritual. Runs screaming from it, ends up back at the house, and is basically cornered by a shitload of, like, druids and shit.
Druids and cultists and who knows what else.
There's so much that's good in this one. The first is that Bloch is, like, not cribbing from Lovecraft nearly as much as in previous ones. There is some stuff that is, like, I think instead of, like, a copy meant to be, like, a wink, wink, nod, nod to other work, there's, like, a well that is emanating this, like, ghastly luminescent fluid, and I'm like, oh, okay, like, you know, like, color out of space, that's kind of cool. There is a Shoggoth, and it is collected in the same sort of way as, what's Dunwich? Dunsmore? What's
Dunwich.
Dunwich, yeah. And then Bloch decides, okay, I'm actually going to flex the thing I'm good at, which is thriller writing, and they get almost out. They almost get out.
Yeah.
And it is so fucking frustrating that they get just dragged back in. The kid has like 9 shots at this. And coming from the Derleth work where like the humans win, it's like, oh no, man.
It's the thing that strikes me too, right, is that he doesn't say like it's his last will and testament at first. He doesn't say there are people breaking down. But as you get into the end of the story, you suddenly realize, like, what's the name of the story? Notebook found in a deserted house.
Right.
And it's like, oh, fuck. Like, if he survived this would not be... And it's just... It really kind of hammers home, again, this very early found footage sort of feeling. Like, this is something that someone else was stumbling through the woods, found an old decrepit house, and just, like, found this notebook lying on the ground. And it's like, oh, shit. That makes it, like, a lot more... I wouldn't say scary, but it just gives you these shivers. It's very effective.
Mm-hmm.
This would be like, I think on Halloween I'm going to read this one to the Patreon hangout. Just have a little nice sit-down ghost story. Yeah. Very good. If you don't read anything else in here, I guess this one, probably.
I would probably... I'd pick a
Yeah.
different one, but yeah, it's one of the top ones. I will say...
It's close.
This is probably also an appearance of Nyarlathotep, given that there's a kind of some potential shape-shifting. But what I really like about this one is that you don't know, right?
Yeah.
Like, it could be Nyarlathotep. It could be that the cousin is just a cultist, right? And I think...
Yeah, you never really find out.
I think that's kind of like the important part, right? Is that to some degree... the evil of the old gods and the outer gods and shit, it's just kind of us, right? It's the same sort of primordial evil that like manifests in like original sin and shit. In that way, you know, Nyarlathotep lives in the hearts of men, just like in the literal skin of the fucking atomic scientist dude.
Yeah. Well, just in general, it's one of the things that's often kind of overlooked with Lovecraftian horror, because so many people are focused on the entities, but most of the time it's not the entities that are causing the problems. It's the cultists. It's the people who decide to worship these giant uncaring things, whether it be because of like a search for power or a thirst for knowledge or whatever weird reason. It's the people causing the problems, not these uncaring outer beings. But enough about that one. The next one on the list is The Salem Horror by Henry Kuttner. And it's honestly pretty good. I'd put it, it's not as scary as Notebook in a Deserted House, but in the same way that's just like a Lovecraft story done right, probably like a couple decades after he died. It's the same thing. The only reason I didn't include it in yours is because it doesn't really like add a whole lot. But I'd check it out. It's pretty decent. Has some witchcraft stuff, though, which is kind of... Witchcraft just doesn't scare me. I don't know about you. And after that, we get The Terror from the Depths by Fritz Lieber. And this is the one you almost didn't read this one. You're like, is it okay that I didn't finish this one? I'm like, you have to finish this one.
Yeah, unfortunately, I did, but I just don't have a lot to say about it.
Oh, I thought you said this was one of the ones that you really liked.
I mean, I liked it. I just don't have too much to say about it.
Oh, okay.
For me, this one was sort of like the antithesis of Shadow over Innsmouth, right? In the way that Shadow over Innsmouth is like an individual that has this obscene inherited fate succumbs to the understanding of it. The Terror from the Depths is about someone with an inherited fate fucking it up and dying. And it rocks. It's so cool. And they reference it too. They're like, I wonder how that guy in Innsmouth is doing. And he's like, I hope it's good. And then he like gets fucked up and it's like, I bet that guy is not doing good actually based on how this one went.
Yeah, so this one I thought was interesting for a number of reasons. One, it's just kind of spooky in general. It's one of the better written, more scary stories in here. But two, it does kind of do that thing. A lot of Lovecraft was kind of not obsessed, but there are several stories, Shadow of Innsmouth being the most important one, or the most well-known one, where there's this idea of, like, what if I'm tainted? What if I'm just, like, naturally corrupted? Which is understanding coming from Lovecraft, because, like, both of his parents died in insane asylums.
Yeah, like, read into that what you will.
But yeah, it does also come across, like, very racist in a lot of ways. It comes across, like, he has some other stories, I'm sure you haven't read them, I've read them, unfortunately, but it's like, what if I'm descended from a black guy? Dun dun dun!
I'm always asking myself this. Dude, that'd be crazy.
I forget the name of it. There's one story where it literally is just like a guy finding out that his great-grandfather like inbred with some cult in Africa, and like that's the scary part. And it's it's absolutely dreadful. But this one, I think, does an excellent job of like taking that trope and removing it from the genetic element of having this horror of like, what if I have a destiny, but it's a bad destiny? What if I'm destined to be like swallowed up by the earth? What if I'm linked in some way to these ancient beings that aren't interested in anything that humans have to do, that are just like completely alien to me, and that's where I belong, down in the depths with them. And it's very effective at that. It's very, very creepy. The third thing it does is it adds Lovecraft into his own mythos in a way that none of the other ones have, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, in Derleth, they mention, like, oh, you need to read Lovecraft. He had some information about this. But this is the first one that, like, actually explains, like, oh yeah, that guy from Innsmouth, that really did happen. They basically mention all his stories, like Dunwich Horror, The Color Out of Space, everything gets referenced, and they sort of lay it out as these events happened at some point, and then people that Lovecraft knew sort of told the stories to him. He had all these connections, and then he wrote them down as fiction because no one in the scientific community or no one of the authorities would have believed it if he had told them it was a real story. And even though these are fictionalized accounts, they have this kernel of the truth buried within them. Some of these things do happen, just not exactly. And I think that's a really neat way to evolve the mythos, to include him into his own mythos, like, retroactively. And then just the final thing here is, I can't say for sure because I've never been out west, really. But I feel like this kind of did for deserts and western topography what Lovecraft did for New England, or Derleth did for the Midwest.
Oh, I see what you mean.
It really goes out of its way to talk about, like, the vastness of the desert, the rumbling of the ground, the sense that, like, where you're walking isn't entirely sound, all the underground caverns and everything. Someone who's from, like, California or Nevada or New Mexico can maybe tell us. But it is interesting to see. This is from, like, the 70s. So it's like, as people move west, they found ways to find the horror in their own setting. And I think that's kind of an untapped thing. Like, when you think of some place like Arizona, it's like, humans were not meant to live in Arizona. It's like 150 degrees there all the time. You need, like, air conditioning or you will die. It's kind of an untapped resource for the idea of nature and horror existing in the wider world and being at odds with humanity. But yeah, moving on, we had Rising with Circe by Brian Lumley. Thoughts on this one, MBT?
I'm fading. Give me a sec on this one. Can you run it back for me?
It's like a narrative told after the fact, and a lot of these are. What was it? It starts with he's like, I'll write this down for the psychologist who keep insisting I'm crazy. I want to let you know, I did attack my brother, he is dead, but I did it not because I'm insane, but because it was the only logical choice given the situation. Which is a hell of a hook.
Man is very clearly insane.
And then goes to talk about how he got into the occult stuff. He had some Call of Cthulhu style nightmares, like waking nightmares, where he went to an asylum for like a year. And then one day just got better, but wasn't quite himself.
And
had to wear spooky goggles.
He had made vague references to, like, Cthulhu operating in his body, and it turns out an ancient sub-oceanic priest has functionally switched places with Julian, who has now become some sort of, like, big fucking Shoggoth or something.
Yeah.
And the scene culminates in this crazed priest trying to perform an arcane ritual is interrupted by his brother killing him to death with a hot poker, and then killing his brother because his brother was like, no, I'm gonna get fucking killed.
Because his brother's like, I don't want to be trapped in a fucking Shoggoth body for the rest of my life. This is nightmare.
This is a weird mistaken identity shape-shifting adjacent story that Nyarlathotep does not do.
Yeah.
So, shouts out to him. He took a backseat on this one. But the way in which it differs is there is a lot of focus put on phrenology in this one.
Oh, does it? I must have missed that.
It's not explicitly referenced by name.
I never got into phrenology.
Oh, I'm a huge proponent of it. That's why I like Lovecraft. No, I'm fucking kidding, of course. There's so many, like, weird references in this one to, like, the weak chin of his brother becoming at once sharp and confident, and, like, the caveman brow, and, like, of course, so much ink is used on describing the eyes, like the eyes betray the evil of the thing. And it is very funny because until very recently, like, phrenology was scientific, right?
Yeah, or tried to be.
It was
I
science.
guess for people who don't know, because I feel like this is one of those things that's almost fallen beyond the wayside.
Shit.
Phrenology was this pseudoscience based on, like, oh, we can tell, like, how good of a person you are or what your talents are based on the shape of your skull.
Oh, and
and it tried to be very scientific, but was mostly just kind of like a racist.
Yeah, here's an interesting little coincidence. It turns out the shape of the skull that makes you a lazy criminal is pretty consistent along racial hierarchies.
Yeah.
Ooh, wow, how did that happen? And it turns out how it
What a
happened is
surprise.
everyone was just making shit up.
What's funny is the only reason I kind of know about this is because little bits of the phrenology shit has made itself into incel culture.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's the same type of thing. The concept that, like, you are unconfident or subhuman or, like, low T or, like, beta or something if you have, like, thin wrists or, like, a subangular eye glint. It's wild. But
you're a sub-8 male, Jimmy. Cindy will never love you.
Yeah. No, but it is rooted in a very real insecurity that you basically clothed itself in science, not unlike the person literally clothing themselves like the brother in this one. And
I guess that's why I didn't even think about it, because it doesn't use it to describe, like, a particular type of person. It kind of just describes, like, oh, his brother, he lacked confidence, and then
like,
he gained confidence.
You
and I
can
missed
see
that
the difference.
you could
in
tell
his
it
features.
because of his chin. Yeah.
It's amazing. But and of course the entire thing is concerned with, like, body misplacement, right? Like the features of the body betraying the true, understanding of what lurks within. And of course, it to some degree, Julian's terror at the end is a very profound, like, fucking body dysphoria, right? It's wild. And I don't know. I don't want to, like, suck Brian Lumley's teat too much on this one, but it's so fucking smart to put this in here for a work that contains a non-subtle critique of science and the scientific method to include atomic science as a plot point, a science that is very real but also very destructive. Phrenology, a science that is, I'm pretty sure by 71, just like literal hokum. And it opens with a passage on the coelacanth, an animal that has confounded scientific understanding. And he's deploying all of these within the same type of literary traps that Lovecraft was so keen to fall into, the subtle racism of phrenology playing a part in this work in a very literal sense, the destructiveness and general anxiety of the power of the old gods represented through atomics, and the insufficiencies of the scientific method represented through ancient sea-dwelling creatures, here described by name as a creature we found in, like, the 60s. I think that Lumley is doing so much great stuff in here, not apologizing for the baggage of Lovecraft, but integrating sort of the failures of it into, a really excellent story within the mythos.
Yeah. This one, I basically had almost no notes on it, because the only reason I included it was just because it's just a solid modern Lovecraftian story. In many ways, it feels almost like an update of Call of Cthulhu.
Mm.
Like, this has all the same kind of things about, like, the madness coming on and creatures from the sea taking over your mind and the visions of Dark Raelia, but sort of translated into a more modern setting, including all the pseudoscience stuff.
But yeah, that's what an updated Lovecraft would be. It would be an understanding that...
Oh, fuck.
What?
I just realized, like, a modern Lovecraft story would deal with, like, vaccines and, like...
Oh, we gotta write it, buddy.
Like,
here's the next one.
We've gotta write, like, weird conspiracy theorist shit where they're like, they're right. And also, it's all narcoleptic. Joe Biden is it.
Q is revealed to be Nyarlathotep. Like,
the haunter in the dark.
Nyarlathotep learned how to post. That's how we got to the present moment.
So this next one you didn't read, and I almost regret it in retrospect, because unlike Notebook Found in a Deserted House, where that one, I feel like our synopsis doesn't do it justice, right? Like, I could describe it, but it doesn't really get the idea across. This is the opposite. It is not a good story. I did not enjoy it, but the synopsis makes it sound amazing. Because it's almost comical if it wasn't so dark. It's told from the perspective of this, like, completely unredeemable asshole, like someone who just finds contempt in everyone. And he's also really into sadism. They make a whole thing about, he really likes to read books about, like, whips and chains and people being dominated and violated and stuff. And he considers it high literature. He looks down on the people who think that it's lewd because this is true high art. And the story is about him trying to find forbidden tomes and accidentally stumbling upon a cult who have different kinds of forbidden tomes, right? Like, he's looking for pornography and finds a Lovecraft book and ends up getting involved with and then eaten by a weird shape-shifting headless monster with, like, mouths on its hands. And it's one of those, I don't know if there's a name for this genre, but I find it pops up more and more in modern horror stories where, like, you're supposed to dislike the narrator. You kind of want to see the characters get killed
fucked
by the monster because they're not very good. They're not good people. There's just, like, nothing good about them. It's just slimy all the way through. And, you know, some people really like that. It's certainly, like, if you want a story where the main character is not this upstanding scientific gentleman, this is a good way, like, the seedy underbelly of it. But I just didn't really enjoy it all that much.
Yeah, that's fair.
After that, there's the return of Loingor? I have no idea. You have the book in front of you, right?
Man, I don't know how to say this one. It is...
Yeah, I don't either.
It's the return of the
Langoliers.
Yeah.
Clearly, this is a prequel to that Stephen King book.
Where are the fucking beams?
And this one, it starts really good. It has a ton of, like, lore built into it. It's about this guy, like, investigating some eldritch horror or whatever, and then he finds, he's like an old colonel in the British Navy or something like that, who's lost standing because he got really into all this occult shit. And they form this sort of charming bro friendship, actually, that's kind of neat. And they go searching for Lovecraftian entities and try to prove it. But it's really let down by the end because it's like they find proof of these energy-based beings that live in the core of the earth and affect things on the surface. And then they escape. And then the rest of the, like, there's like 4 or 5 pages at the end of them just kind of like going around trying to tell people about it, and everyone laughs at them and tells them they're dumb and thinks they're really into, everyone just thinks they're grifters, like trying to sell books and stuff like that. And then they just disappear one day. And it's like, oh, okay. Whatever. Very, very weird. It might be worth reading if you really like the lore, but it's kind of low on the horror elements, you know? And same thing for My Boat. My Boat is actually really good. I would highly recommend checking it out. It's also the only thing in this collection written by a woman. This is Joanna Russ. And it actually takes more from Lovecraft's, like, dream cycle stuff. I forget if last year, did you read The White Ship?
We did, yeah.
Yeah, you remember that? That's more like fantastical fairy tale dream logic kind of stuff than it is horror. Like, this is sort of like that, but updated for, like, a 1970s audience. And they're really good at writing this, like, narrative voice. I won't spoil anything about it because I do recommend checking it out. It's pretty short and it's very well written. It's just not spooky or Halloween themed. And then we come to Styx by Carl Edward Wagner. And you, I believe, had quite a bit to write about this one.
I don't know if I had too much to say about it. I really liked it. I think it was my favorite of the ones that we read. The quick synopsis is Colin Leverett is an artist and one day comes across a bunch of sticks that are sticking out of the ground at very strange angles. And he's like, that's a strange geometry. You know, a phrase that always means that you are going to get fucking eaten by a evil hound or something.
Watch out for geometry.
Right, so he starts drawing them like a fucking idiot, and then he goes into a stone cottage that he finds walks down to the
that
basement.
is surrounded by them.
Yeah, walks down to the basement, finds that, oh, actually, this is the basement to a much larger house, and the smaller house was built on top of it. Something's going on down here. He finds this large stone slab with like grooves on it. And as he's running his hands over the grooves, a hand comes out and grabs him. And it is a lich. And he takes a frying pan that he had gone to because he was going fishing originally.
Yeah.
He takes an iron pan and he fucking domes the guy. And he runs back upstairs. It runs after him, but he makes it out. Then he goes to war. He gets fucking drafted.
Yeah, all that first part happens in, like, what was it, like 1939? He's just like, let me tell you a story about before the war. And then he goes to war, comes back years later.
He starts drawing again. He is an artist by trade, but his drawings are too haunting. I think there's a reference to, like, they reflect a poisoned mind or something. Even the like weird tales are like, this is a little too fucking scary.
They're
for
a little
us.
too graphic. I think he said part of he's already had a macabre mind, and his experiences with the war just like didn't help him. He's like, yeah, we wanted you to draw 3 people hanging, but something about the bloat around their neck just like seems too real. It makes us too ill. The inhumanity of war creeping into the Lovecraft mythos.
And then of course at the end he is commissioned by a man who turns out to be the Lich, and he goes down and he gets killed by a Lich.
Yeah.
That's basically it.
Yeah. Well, the thing before that, and something that I found interesting, almost from like a science fiction perspective, because he wrote down all the stick formations, right? Because he talks about they're like these weird like collection, these bundles of sticks, not quite letters. And he sketches them all down. And then he starts putting them in the margins of his drawings. And people are like, oh, suddenly these drawings seem a lot more interesting. And that's when he gets called by the Lich. And they talk about, like, these bundles of sticks are actually, like, 3-dimensional letters. They're letters that don't just exist on, like, a flat plane, but have to be positioned in different places in the world to spell out a message. Which is, I don't know, something about that just seems like real, like, if there were going to be 4-dimensional beings, it makes sense that they would have a 3-dimensional language that they would write in. And by him writing those representations of them in the books, and then spreading the books around the country, they are helping the cult fulfill their message and spread their web of, like, this spell or curse or whatever it is across the entire country.
I will say the couple of things that I liked about this one were, first, liches. Not a lot of liches in these stories.
No.
It's very cool. And there is a ley lines sort of understanding of evil. Like evil is a web rather than an individual.
Yeah.
It is a system that needs to be built and maintained. There is construction involved, and like the state of this web is basically in disarray, they reveal at the end.
Yeah.
But the contact after the war is enough to set it aflame again. Liches are these like huge fucking necromancers that command legions of undead, kind of, right?
Yeah.
And it's not hard to see, you know, how that parallels with the experience of World War II. I mean, for me at least, the frightening part of the Styx as a concept is just that evil isn't a random event or an ambitious individual or a repugnant ideology. It's a system that is maintained and is upheld, sometimes unknowingly, by the people who participate in it. And that I thought was the neat little lesson in Styx that the guy learns at the literal last second before dying.
Yeah.
And by the time he has the
that,
chance...
Because, it's like, you know, he finds out he's a puppet of the Lich, not only because he helped spread it, but you find out later that, like, drawing all the symbols allows them to, like, mind control him. He has these, like, nightmares
at the end,
that he's killing people.
He's literally powerless to stop it. He's like, I've lost agency in my interaction with the system.
Because they force him to kill one of the scientists that's trying to help him out, and he doesn't, like, realize it until much later. He, like, wakes up and there's blood on his hands. And that really is an excellent idea of how these huge systems, like, you know, people are just trying to live their lives, they're trying to do the best they can, and one day you wake up to find that you've got blood on your hands, and how did that happen? And why can't I stop it now? It's quite horrifying being part of a giant unstoppable web.
This one particularly spoke to me. The one little like cute thing that this book does is also you finish it and you go, wait a minute, was the end of this book that publishing the book is what caused the ley lines to appear, which I am now reading in a book. Awesome.
It's one of those things where it's like,
anything.
If they had published this on its own or in a different collection, and the margins were just filled with all these little scribbles of the stick formations,
I'd be like, God damn it,
yeah,
you got me.
I'd be like, oh, that's such a cool move. Very, very meta going out there. But unfortunately, the version I have is just text. So the next one, another one you didn't read, the last of the ones you didn't read, and for good reason. This one's called The Freshman by Philip Jose Farmer, and it tries to be horrific in some ways. It's almost comedic, though. It's about a 50-year-old guy who enrolls at Miskatonic University. So you finally get to see, like, what the mythical university that he's always, like, I'm not sure if you've noticed that's appeared in almost, like, every Lovecraft story. It's always like, oh, you've got occult stuff, you gotta talk to Miskatonic U. Oh, you need a Necronomicon? I hear they have a copy in their library. And then you go there and you find out, like, all the professors are, like, really into occult stuff. They're all kinds of wizards. The frats are all, like, instead of having Greek alphabets, they have this weird esoteric alphabet. Except for House Hastur.
Uniform.
Yeah. Except for House Hastur. They're just named after one of the great old ones.
They just threw him in there.
It's House Hastur and they're wearing all yellow. It's like, oh yeah, the king in yellow, I get it. And they're all the different fraternities are trying to recruit this guy. They're like, oh no, you gotta check it. Like, our rituals that we use to initiate the pledges, they're hardly ever fatal. And you get access to our library. And every frat's just trying to be like, our library has the most forbidden tomes. You don't even know. And I'm making it to be more comedic than it is. There is a serious element to it, but I just couldn't get over the fact that I'm like, this is Miskatonic U, where it's like, what is their, like, football team? Like, the Fighting Cthulhus? Like, it just seems almost like a parody of Lovecraft rather than a part of it. But I mean, that's kind of the thing, right? Is once you get into the 90s, a lot of the Lovecraft stuff, people just start taking the piss out of it. That's when you start seeing, like, Cthulhu on South Park and stuff. So then, after that, we have Jerusalem's Lot by Stephen King, which you read last year when we did our Stephen King thing.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have much to add.
Yeah.
I still do like this one. The concept of the worm is, like, everywhere in all of the Lovecraft stuff, and this is one where I'm like, it's actually done justice, I suppose.
It is really interesting where, like, I remember reading this last year and being like, oh yeah, this feels really Lovecraftian, but he invented his own book, The Mystery of the Worm. And then I go back to read these and find, like, the Mystery of the Worm is put alongside the Necronomicon, like, all through these. It's just slightly more obscure than the Necronomicon.
It's a deep cut.
But it's still, like, yeah, he just took one of the, the existing books and kind of expanded on it to make its own lore, and just did it really, really well. And again, just brings in everything. The found footage style of, like, oh, this is the old journal and the old letters that were being written back then. The idea of, like, the family line or whatever is corrupted. And of course, that final stinger at the end, I'm not sure if you remember exactly how it ends. Where it's like, up until now, the story has taken place in, like, the 1930s. And then you get one final line from someone from the 1970s.
He's like, it's me, the second cousin.
He's like, my family, like, with my death, the family line will be gone and this horror will be eliminated. 1938. And then in 1978, he's like, well, he didn't know me, his second cousin, and I've come back to the house and found his clearly mad ramblings, and I'm going to take over the house, and I don't believe in any of this stuff, although there are a lot of big rats in the walls.
Very smart.
Like, very silly. But yeah, finally, that brings us to the last story in this compilation, and by far the strangest of all of them, Discovery of the Gorick Zone by Richard A. Lupoff.
This whole thing smacks of gender. This is
got gender everywhere.
This is such a good one. This is honestly maybe my favorite upon reflection. Is
I am surprised at how progressive it is for 1977. Like, holy shit.
I mean, it's sort of progressive. It gets
Sort of. I mean, the literally the first paragraph is like, 3 cyborgs are having a 3-way, and one of them's like a non-binary them.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, it's played as like a bit. There's a pansexual revolution, and like it's kind of a bad thing. I mean, there's a lot going on in this one.
It's weird. It's hard to tell if it's like, is this supposed to be a bad thing, or is this just supposed to be how history unfolded?
So, quick synopsis of this one.
Good luck.
It takes place in the year 2337, in which 3 different humans with vaguely cybernetic enhancements. They're traveling beyond our solar system to find what lies beyond, and they find one of the dark planets. And
one of the planets that Lovecraft mentioned way back in, I forget what story, but he's mentioned that like some of the cosmic horrors were supposed to come from this planet. I forget what they call it. It's not the Gorick Zone.
No, it's I'll just fucking flip it up. Yuggoth, something like that.
Yeah, he describes like Yuggoth with its 10 moons, and then they're like, oh, we've discovered a new planet out beyond Pluto, but it's way, way out there. So they send this team of cyborgs out there, and they find it, and it's like exactly as he described. It's like this big brownish dwarf of a gas giant with like 10 moons, including a pair of binary moons. And the one girl who's read Lovecraft is like, it's exactly that.
Yeah, thankfully one of the 3 people is a fucking nerd.
Which I mean, especially like, what is this, like 400 years in the future? And she still knows who Lovecraft is.
So, a couple of very interesting things about this one. This like narrative of them just chilling and finding the Gorick Zone, which, by the way, goes fine. Like, at the very end, there's like a cave-in on this gas giant, and they kind of get trapped in the fucking lake or something because they're post-human beings. They live forever, so it kind of sucks. But, like, that's not that bad in the grand scale of things.
Yeah, get to hang out with the Shoggoths.
And each other. Like, they clearly are, they're down to fuck. Like, that's going to be a fun 300 years. But in every little, like, page and a half, there is a cut to a different 100-year period. So it starts like in 2337, and it's described a different way. Then 2237, then 2137, then 2037, then 1937. Right?
Yeah. Going back to Lovecraft's death and the start of World War II.
Right, and it is a very, very interesting concept of transhumanist understanding of humanity. This is, to me, the one that raises the most interesting questions, because it is like fundamentally the concept of the old gods as relational to humans. Well, it's rooted in these like primordial fears. It's rooted in these like ancient unspeakable evils, but like transcending the primordial or biologic of humanity necessitates a conquering of these like old ones, the like fundamental fears. And over the course of the human history, there is an invasion by like Cthulhu and pals, and humans win.
Like literally, the deep ones rise up, and the weird transhuman cyborg collectives. I think at this point they're like, there's 2 countries.
Right.
There's one that extends from like South America down over to Antarctica, which is now warm and sunny due to climate change, and then like the Pan-Afro-Asia Europe
right.
consulate or whatever that worships their god emperor. And then they both like stop fighting and team up because Cthulhu rises out of the sea and tries to wipe humans away. And
they dome him. Like they fucking annihilate him. Like it's
Send
not
him
close.
back out into the cosmos. They're like, get the fuck off our planet.
It is it is just it's so interesting because I don't know. I don't want to get into a long like hour-long discussion of transhumanism, but transhumanism is both an augmentation of humanity insofar as like the cyborgs that are in this story, like some of them like turn into a motorcycle to go traverse terrain and like laugh at the guy who has to walk on his legs like a fucking doofus.
Yeah.
Some individuals like cling to a concept of primordial humanity in like one guy keeps his dick and it causes problems for him because he gets erectile dysfunction. And it's like, you stupid idiot. Like, the whole point of transcending humanity is to do just that, is to supplement it in such a way that you can remove the limitations of the old body, and therefore the mechanism by which the old gods reign over primordial human understanding and fear. I think first and foremost, the reason this looks so out of place in the fucking Lovecraft canon is because it's part of like a mid-70s wave of cyborg literature, in which like transhumanist and primarily feminist authors would begin to imagine the cyborg as a thought experiment, as like an unsexed being. And the individual who has retained masculinity is super fucking frustrated for like a page that one of the cyborgs isn't like visibly a binary gender. They're like, well, what the fuck am I supposed to do here? But, you know, they're also having sex, so it's, you know, they know some stuff.
They're also having a three-way with it, so they're not too picky.
Yeah, so, like...
But yeah, I just love... Because that's the thing about transhumanism, right? Is it brings up that question of, like, you know, if I've replaced my body with a robot body that can just swap out genitals on the fly, like, I can be whatever I want, baby.
Right,
like,
I would,
literally any idea of the preconceived notion of what gender would be, like, it doesn't matter anymore. I've moved beyond it.
If anyone listening has their interest piqued by this discussion, do look up like Cyborg Lit. It has evolved into a very interesting and rich tapestry of transhumanist literature, both fiction and nonfiction, that is really interesting. And this, I believe, is more that than Lovecraft.
Yeah.
You get a sense that, like, this is an alt history in which there is first a triumph over atomic science. That's like what the 2037 one starts with. The Soviet Asian Peninsula, the United States, and Britain kind of fall beyond the wayside as atomic science becomes outdated and humanity like transcends beyond it. That's followed by a feminist revolution based on worldwide thought, followed by a sexual revolution worldwide, which translates into these basically two god emperors that I think are implied to be anti-outer god forces, like imbued with the same sort of power, stand-ins potentially for earthly interpretations of these beings.
It's really hard to say because it's like, you know, they have literally the history of the world for 400 years condensed into a story that's like 20 pages, maybe.
Yeah, and then the question then isn't, oh, what happens when a Shoggoth shows up? You know, oh my God, it's like humanity has transcended its primordial fears. So where does that leave the Lovecraft mythos? Where does that leave like fundamental understandings of humanity through shared anxiety in a world without it? And it really takes a literal voyage to the source, hundreds of years in the making, for them to locate the, you know, dark star, which turns out to just be a place. Yeah. It's not this like mysterious half universe compelled by dark entities. It's just a fucking planet.
Yeah.
And like suddenly the whole thing snaps into place. It's like, oh, if these are interplanetary fucking creatures that are feet beyond our solar system, we all know how they got here, right? They smashed in on a meteor or something. Suddenly the mystery is gone, and the fear that is sort of expressed by the unknown represented in all the Lovecraft mythos is replaced by the inevitability of the known in this one. And like finding the Gorick Zone is like cool and interesting. Like the cyborg character is excited to see a Shoggoth. It's wild.
It's one of those, you know, like I said, the Lovecraft creed, or not the creed, but his sort of motto, the thing that he's known for is fear is the strongest human emotion. Fear of the unknown is the strongest fear. And he always had this sort of pessimism to him of if we find things out, it will destroy us. Mm-hmm. And this kind of posits the questions of like, what if we just learned everything and we adapted to it and it didn't destroy us? And on the one hand, there is sort of like an optimism to it about the fact that like, humans did fight off the deep ones. Humans did find these things. And now we're like the equals. But depending on who you show it to, someone could see this with, like, now it's not that we've overcome the cosmic horror. Now it's we've become the cosmic horrors. We have perhaps lost our humanity, some might argue. Not me. I would be really curious to see some, like, reviews of this, or what people thought of the Gorick Zone. Because I think it'd be an interesting sort of almost litmus test to see who saw this as, like, a horrifying future, and who saw this as an almost optimistic, interesting future.
I did look it up. I did look some stuff up about Gorick Zone because I had to know. I found, I guess I there's no way to do this. I was on Reddit and gets very mixed reviews. Some people are like, it's my favorite. And some people are like, this is the worst mythos story ever written. Like, it's so fucking bad.
To be fair, I think the first time I read it, I didn't think it was the worst, but I remember reading it and just being like, what the fuck was that? It was too weird and out there for me to really wrap my head around or really get the context of everything.
I will say, personally, I really loved it. I thought it fucking sick. But I am a huge sucker for cyborg lit.
Yeah.
I'm a huge sucker for, like, transhumanist fiction. So, you know, pretty much written for me. But I do appreciate that rather than looking backward, as so much of Lovecraft adjacent work does, it posits the question, what happens if we go forward, and what happens if things turn out all right?
Yeah.
We had people time traveling in this anthology, and they didn't think to go in the front ways direction.
Like, everyone always looks back. It's always prehistoric. It's always the past. We need more future Lovecraft stuff, and not just like you go out in space and find Cthulhu. Like, it's gotta be more than that.
But like the fundamental assumption of Lovecraftian work a lot of the time is there exists a deep primordial understanding within human culture that our fears are valid and that we are innately prevented from doing things by forces we cannot comprehend. And it just shocks me that like people have such a knee-jerk response to, well, what if we comprehended it?
Yeah, but what if we did comprehend it? What if,
right?
It's not even just a knee-jerk response. It's so amazing to me that like in everything I've read that like this is the only story where they do comprehend it. Like it's such an untouched subject, and the few times it is, it's like almost done for comedy.
Yeah,
it's
like
it's one of those things like, oh, I met Cthulhu, and then I like captured him in a Pokeball, and now we're buddies. Like,
right. It's like, imagine if at the end of Hounds he was like, wait, it's just right angles? I know that shit. Easy.
It's simple. I'll just wear a dome on my head. I just have a circular dome. We'll be fine. They'll keep them away. We're good. But anyway, we've been here for far too long. But hopefully you enjoyed all this. It's always fun having these spooky stories. You are one of my favorite people to comment with. Don't tell CB Radio. That's the normal host.
You did a good job hiding that there at the end. No one's gonna make it this far. Oh man.
I don't know. The 2-hour long Stephen King one we did is like our second most popular episode.
This is
people
longer than 2 hours.
People absolutely love to hear people just a little bit. I'll edit it down to 2 hours.
You better edit it down to 1 hour. I said some dumb shit here today.
But yeah, thank you for joining me, MBT. I guess I'd shout out your channel, but no one's watched this far. Right?
Yeah, right. I really appreciate you having me on, dude. I don't know. I mean, we don't get to do it as often as we'd like, I think, as Americans who live in a fucking world in which all of our time is demanded by all people at all times. But the state of fiction right now is just, man, it's bleak. And it's great to sit down and like read and think about books. And I always cherish the opportunity to do it. I'm always happy to jump in here and talk about some stupid shit, provided you will cut about 200 pages out of the assignment so that I can get it done in time.
I'll try to pick something shorter next time.
Next month, we're going to do The Cat in the Hat.
But really next month, for those of you who are following along and looking forward to CB Radio's return, we're going to be doing the 13th and 14th Wheel of Time novels. That's The Gathering Storm and The Towers of Midnight. Just in time for the show to finally start. we're almost finished. We're going to do those two, and then the final book we're going to do is its own and sort of a series wrap-up. So you can look forward to that. Either way, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. Have a happy Halloween. And I never know how to end these. Do you got something to end this with?
No.
Good.